Be strong.
Oh, you press record. Well done.
You didn't even have to remind me, mate. You didn't have to remind me.
Oh, very good. All right, let's get stuck into it. Well, it's the first day of spring, Damo, and the sun's out, and I can safely say that your guns are out too. An absolute privilege for those watching on the video today. Welcome.
Yeah, a bit of a change of scenery, Rob. I thought I'd take it outside today. Such a lovely day. So yeah, got the guns out for everyone that is watching. Yeah, if you're on the podcast, you'll have to tune into the screencast.
Mate, so how many push-ups and bicep curls have you done before this podcast?
Just a quick pump in the garage, mate. You know, there's been, anyone that's been looking at the YouTube channel, there's a few shorts coming out. So there's been a bit of filming. So I have to be in tip-top shape for that.
Absolutely. And I really like your landmine one you've done as well. So if you want to see a bit of creative ingenuity for exercising at home, check out Damo's DIY landmine video. It's pretty good. So make sure you have a look at that. Firstly, welcome back to the DeakHeads podcast. Just Damo and myself today. There's no Sean. I'm not sure where he is. Probably prancing around Parkville or the University of Melbourne campus. But thanks for tuning in. Today's episode, though, we're going to talk about something pretty important, Damo, and it's something that's caused a bit of debate over the past week, and that is the pay discrepancies between Paralympic athletes and Olympic athletes, or in really the case is the fact that there's no pay for Paralympic medalists compared to the Olympic counterparts. So it's a pretty contentious topic, isn't it?
Yeah, this is something that we wanted to get out a little bit earlier, but we've just sort of been stuck on it. But I have noticed since the start of the Paralympics, there's been a bit of chatter around, especially in the sort of sports science sector. I've seen a few people actually set up some GoFundMe pages and stuff like that for the Paralympians, because as you said, they don't actually receive anything for winning a medal. Yeah. And if you have been tuning into the Paralympics, we've actually been lighting it up. It's been heaps and heaps of medals. So it might have actually sent the AOC or the Paralympic Committee bankrupt if they did pay out for all the medals there. But yeah, so I guess that the first thing that we probably need to cover is like the point of reference. So for what our Olympians get paid for medals. So at the 2020 Games, at the Olympics, any athlete that got a gold medal was $20,000 per gold. $15,000 per silver and $10,000 per bronze. Now, in the grand scheme of countries around the world, it's actually not that high, the amount that they get paid, but they probably do get a bit more support from the Olympic body and their institutes of sports and stuff like that. So they don't necessarily need to be paid large amounts. Like I know the Philippines, the gold medalist there got $750,000 US, so nearly $1 million, which is ridiculous, but it was their first ever gold. So Australians get paid a little bit lower, I guess, compared to other people around the world. But then the big discrepancy here, as we just mentioned, is that our Paralympians don't actually get anything at all.
And not only that, Damo, and what you've said and what you started with is a really good point in terms of the pay, and Australia don't necessarily pay as much, but we even know that there's countries like the UK don't actually pay their Olympic medalists anything. So again, it sort of varies from country to country. I don't think necessarily the value matters that much in terms of how much you pay them, but just as long as it's equal across the board. I think that's what everybody wants, because it doesn't necessarily matter that you don't get paid $100,000 or $750,000 like the Philippines gold medalist, but just as long as that amount's equal. But what we touched upon in a previous podcast episode was the idea a few years ago that the Australian Olympic sort of structure was in terms of funding or performance-based funding for athletes as well. And what you spoke about in depth, and I encourage people to go look at it, was the idea that where you finished in an Olympics would then influence how much funding you got for subsequent Olympic cycles after that. And we also know that has a great effect on Paralympians, don't we?
Yeah, so it's still the case for the Paralympics or the Paralympians of Australia that the funding for their particular sport or event is based on performance. So that high level of pressure that we were talking about, that the winning edge had on our Olympians, that a lot of people complained about, is still actually applicable to our Paralympians. So there's a really good conversation that one of our track and field athletes, Chad Peris, had on the Paralympics podcast on the ABC about how he actually got a silver medal at the Rio Games, and then dropping down to 5th at the Tokyo Games is essentially going to completely destroy the funding that he would get as an athlete, because of his good performance, there's an expectation that to maintain that level of funding, you have to do the same or better. Or if you do worse, then obviously the funding is going to drop. Now that's because something that we'll touch on a little bit later in the podcast, that it's not the same governing body that's looking after funding for the sport. So it's not the Australian Olympic Committee. It's actually the Paralympic Committee that looks after our Paralympians. So while the winning edge is sort of being dissolved and changed into a different style of funding for our Olympians, for the Paralympians, it's still very different and sport and event based.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very important point that maybe people don't realize, is that obviously, the Paralympics occur a couple of weeks after the Olympics. So people think that they're run by the same people at basically a domestic level here in Australia, which isn't the case. They're actually two separate entities, which is important for what we talk about later in terms of the funding and where that funding comes from. But if we talk about the idea of getting this basically equity, I guess you'd call it, across the board maybe, or equality, or whatever you want to call it, and getting consistent pay between the two competitions, it's not a completely foreign concept in between Olympics and Paralympics. Like, we know there's countries that already do this and pay fairly across the board, and the Olympics in particular, the one just gone in Tokyo, America have led the charge in this caper as well. So they have, as of Tokyo, started to pay their Olympic and Paralympic medalists equally, which is the first time that they've done that. And I also know that I think it was the 2018 Winter Olympics that they started doing that as well. I think that retrospectively paid Paralympic medalists from that event after the fact as well. So again, the wheels are starting to turn in this space where we're getting that level of equality, equity, whatever the appropriate term is, from these big nations. So it's not something that's a bit of a pipe dream, is it?
No, it's most of the major players in the Olympics are starting to get that parity in pay. I guess in other sports, it's often discussed about the disparity between male and female athletes. So obviously it's starting to get a little bit better there, like sports like tennis. There's equal pay for the men's and women's. So it's certainly heading in the right direction. And as you just said, like, the US are doing it, but I guess Australia is not the only nation that hasn't moved to that transition to that yet. So we've got, in our research, we found that Canada and Japan don't have equal pay. And then I guess we discussed as well that the UK actually doesn't pay any of their athletes. At least that's equal though. So
yeah, exactly. And that's exactly right. So Japan, they will pay a certain amount for Olympic medalists, and then they pay a lesser amount for the Paralympic medalists. And Canada are the same as Australia; they don't pay Paralympic medalists at all. And I know a lot of people say, well, US is a bigger organization, more money, and they can do that. But like the US, again, they're paying $37,500 per Olympic gold medal, I think, in US dollars as well. So again, it doesn't have to be astronomical amounts that we're talking about that needs to be paid. It just needs to have that consistency across the board. And I think that's the only thing you can really ask for, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Like, in Australia, we're pretty lucky that athletes are well looked after in terms of, if you're aligned with an institute of sport or one of the professional sporting bodies, you are going to get your training and coaching and all that sort of stuff included as part of that package. So I guess as long as the athletes aren't out of pocket in that sense, if the amount that they're getting, they don't have to pay their own way to get over to the Olympics or the Paralympics either. So if that's put on, I guess the amount that you're given then, I think $20,000 is fair. There's plenty of other things that come with winning a gold medal in terms of endorsements and publicity and stuff like that. So I guess that's the bonus. And if they were doing it for money, they potentially would be in a different sport or line of work, because a lot of the Olympic sports are actually not very well paid. Swimming's not something that you can really live off. Athletics, unless you're in the Diamond League, it's quite hard to make a living as well. And then you think about the more like obscure or less funded sports, is most of those people would have a job outside of that. I know the guy in the speed walking for the Australians had to take 4 weeks leave from his accounting job. So they are just everyday people as well, and to go to the Olympics is a privilege, and if they get a little bit extra on top, then it's sort of a nice touch.
Absolutely. And what you said about swimming funding is very interesting, because we also know, and I've seen the media reports and the articles about Gina Reinhart and her financial backing for a lot of Olympic athletes as well, and especially swimming was one that we've seen a lot of sponsorship for. So again, I suppose the funding doesn't obviously extend across the board in terms of the struggles to get appropriate funding for these athletes, depending, or I guess regardless of whether it's Olympics or Paralympics as well.
Yeah, I think the only other thing as well is that we sort of had a discussion off air about this as well, about with Paralympic athletes, there potentially might be more cost involved in servicing the athletes in terms of what, like the coaching. You probably need more specialist coaches to deal with athletes that have impairments or disabilities or stuff like that. It's a little bit more difficult in terms of it's not just your standard coach generally. And then there might be more facilities required in terms of like transport and stuff like that. So for the Paralympics, there might be more overhead costs. So I could kind of understand where potentially they take that into consideration with the amount that they pay, maybe that it was a lower percentage because of maybe the extra funding that would be provided in that sense. But I still think that they should be paid something, even if that is the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that probably ties in beautifully to now maybe talking about some of the structure of the funding that they receive, like the Paralympics Australia, and how that sort of works. And we've briefly alluded to it in that the Paralympics Australia and the Australian Olympic Committee are both two separate entities or two separate companies as well. So that's probably something that needs to be made pretty clear, is that it's not just all the money is getting pushed into the Australian Olympic Committee and they just give it out to, or prioritise Olympians over Paralympians as well. So they're two separate entities there. But however, the funding obviously will come from the federal government and maybe some private funding as well, depending on who the relevant stakeholders are. But we know that there's a bit of a discrepancy between the amount of funding and the revenues that get turned over between Paralympics Australia and the Australian Olympic Committee. I think that going off the annual reports quoted, I think it's about half the revenue, or the turnover for the Paralympics Australia is about half of the Australian Olympic Committee. So I think that, again, that highlights probably where the lack of funding and the resources come from immediately.
Yeah, there'd be several things that sort of go into that. I guess there's probably less athletes and sponsorships that go into that. But when it comes down to government funding, again, it's like it is based on participation and things like that. So if there are less athletes in the Paralympic space, they're obviously not going to get as much funding from the government, or that's the case here in Australia. So there are a few things that go into that, but to be that large a discrepancy is not great.
No, mate, absolutely correct. And what's interesting as well is I think that, like what you said about the funding and the overheads as well, and having to try and distribute like the money across all these different things. Like we know that the cost of some of the wheelchairs and some of the specialized equipment itself, the carbon fiber and some of the equipment is very expensive, isn't it? Like it's not cheap.
Yeah, you're not wrong there, Rob. Like the bikes, the wheelchairs, those types of things, the equipment. Some of the athletics, track and field athletes, if they've got the carbon fiber leg, they're very, very expensive. But I think the other thing as well is that there's a lot more support staff involved. So we did have a discussion about like how certain sports have guides and different things like that. So
yeah,
they all have to travel over as well. So the traveling party and the number of staff and coaches and stuff like that is probably a lot greater than what it is for the Olympic team. So I guess all of these things come into it as well, because all those extra people, that equals extra flights, overheads, equipment, merchandise. It's all got to be put in there. So there, it is sort of understandable that there might, as we said, like some differences, but in terms of, it shouldn't be that one athlete gets 20 grand and the other one doesn't get anything at all. Like it is a huge disparity, because they put in the same amount of effort and training. They go through all the same challenges as what our able-bodied athletes do. So it's probably good that it's come up as a discussion point and there's been a bit of an uproar about it, and that it's hit the media now. There hasn't been any immediate change, but maybe it might be pushing us in the right direction towards what a USA has done, or at least bringing it in that they do get some sort of payment, and then it's justified that, okay, the expenses are a little bit more, so this would be equivalent or relevant to what they can afford to give based on what additional funding and support they get.
Yeah, that's fair enough too, and that's probably a good logical progression from here, I'd say, and suggest. But what you said, like these athletes, they train just as hard. They're just as dominant on the world stage and have similar levels of talent. And one in particular that's really with a caught my eye over the past week has been Maddie Di Rosario, and the fact that she's been in the 800, the 1500, 5000, and is now going to do the marathon as well in the T54, T53 class. So, that's absolutely unbelievable to do that wide ranging of events from an 800 all the way up to a marathon in one Olympics. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it wouldn't happen. The only place you would see that sort of is in the pool at the Olympics. You wouldn't see an athlete compete in that many different events across such a wide spread. So, it's fantastic. And as we said, I did read a few comments about it. The Paralympians is not about, that we're not good enough or we're not athletes. It's actually that they are athletes. They've just got, ailments or disabilities or something wrong with them, but they're still competing at the best to their ability at that level. It's not a charity event. Like, it is a serious athletic event. And I think people often don't realize that they are high performing athletes. And they're, if you're in the same boat as them, you would understand how difficult it is to get to that place.
Mate, absolutely. I could not have put it any better, mate. I think that might be a good sentiment to finish off on for today's episode anyway. But I was really keen to get that chat done as well and published online, because me and you have both spoken about it a fair bit, and Sean as well, that the discrepancies and how good these athletes are. So pretty important topic that we definitely needed to cover, mate.
Yeah, 100%.
Beautiful. Well, good work from you today, Damo. Great to see the pipes out in time for summer. Fortunately, there's no festival for you to go show them off, but thanks very much, mate, for coming on.
Thanks, Rob.
If you've got any value out of today's episode, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It would really mean a lot. But until next time, on behalf of myself, Sean, and Damo's Biceps, we'll see you next time. Oh, the Cobra.